Hello, friends, and welcome to Adventures in Pixie Land. My name is Amy, and I'm an ordained minister. We're in Bible study. We are in the NIV, and we will be through the end of 2025. We are in this video in Leviticus chapter 13, and that's a long one. So let's just jump right in. Remember, this is the Mosaic Law, or at least a portion of it. You have to go back into Exodus, and of course, all of Leviticus is still Mosaic Law. So let's jump in here. Regulations about infectious skin diseases. Now, they'll use the term in the Bible a lot with leprosy, and they don't quite mean it in the way that we think of it in the dramatics of back then with people's limbs falling off. And it was a generic term used for you could have had a rash. They would have called it leprosy. Okay. So they didn't know where the sources of stuff came from. So every reason to, especially if you're going to be migratory, everybody's living in tents, and there's a lot of people in close quarters outside where it's hard to keep things clean. You can imagine this kind of stuff. One person gets sick, and then it's just going to spread through. It's 600,000 people. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, when anyone has a swelling or a rash or a bright spot on his skin, he may become an infectious skin disease. Traditionally leprosy. The Hebrew word was used for various diseases affecting the skin, not necessarily leprosy, also elsewhere in this chapter. He must be brought to Aaron the priest or to one of his sons, or descendants, who is a priest. The priest is to examine the sore on his skin, and if the hair in the sore has turned white and the sore appears to be more than skin deep, be lower than the rest of the skin, and then also elsewhere in this chapter, it is an infectious skin disease. When the priest examines him, he shall pronounce him ceremonially unclean. If the spot on his skin is white, but does not appear to be more than skin deep, and the hair in it has not turned white, the priest is to put the infected person in isolation for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine him, and if he sees the sore is unchanged and has not spread in the skin, he is to keep him in isolation for another 7 days. On that 7th day, the priest is to examine him again, and if the sore has faded and has not spread, the priest shall pronounce him clean. It was only a rash. The man must wash his clothes, and he will be clean. But if the rash does spread in his skin after he has shown himself to the priest to be pronounced clean, he must appear before the priest again. The priest is to examine him, and if the rash is spread to his skin, he shall pronounce him unclean. It's an infectious disease because it went away and it came back. When anyone has an infectious skin disease, he must be brought to the priest. The priest is to examine him, and if there is a white swelling in the skin that has turned the hair white, and if there is raw flesh in the swelling, it is a chronic skin disease, and the priest shall pronounce him unclean. He is not to put him in isolation because he is already unclean. If the disease breaks out all over his skin, so far as the priest can see, it covers all the skin of the infected person from head to foot, the priest is to examine him, and if this disease covers his whole body, he shall pronounce the person... What? If the priest examine him and the disease has covered his whole body, he shall pronounce that person clean. Since it is all turned white, he is clean. Okay. But whenever raw flesh appears on him, he will be unclean. Okay, so that makes more sense to me. I'm like, what? His sores all over his body, but he's clean. But only if it's like, all right. So they're essentially like, if you were to think of the base of it being white, sort of like they're not going to decide a zit or a pimple makes you unclean. So, it's not the same thing as an open sore, which is more that's what the raw flesh would be about, an open sore. All right, so verse 18. When someone has a boil on his skin and it heals, in the place where the boil was, a white swelling or reddish white spot appears. He must present himself to the priest. The priest is to examine it, and if it appears to be more than skin deep and the hair in it has turned white, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infectious skin disease that has broken out where the boil is. But if when the priest examines it, there is no white hair in it, and that it is not more than skin deep and has faded, then the priest is to put him in isolation for 7 days. If it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is infectious. But if the spot is unchanged and that it has not spread, it is only a scar from the boil, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. Because absolutely, that can happen. When someone has a burn on his skin and a reddish white or white spot appears in the raw flesh of the burn, the priest is to examine the spot. If in the hair in it has turned white and it appears to be more than skin deep, it is an infectious disease that has broken out in the burn. It's dirty. The priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infectious skin disease. But if the priest examines it and there is no white hair on the spot, then it is not more than skin deep and has faded, then the priest is to put him in isolation for 7 days. On the 7th day, if the priest examines him and if it is spreading in the skin, the priest shall pronounce him unclean. It is an infectious skin disease. If, however, the spot is unchanged and it has not spread and spread in the skin but is faded, it is swelling from the burn, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. It is only a scar from the burn. I was about to say, it's like, you're going to kick people out of camp because they have scars? Like, no. If a man or woman has a sore on the head or on the chin, the priest is to examine the sore. And if it appears to be more than skin deep, and the hair in it is yellow and thin, the priest shall pronounce that the person is unclean. It is an itch, an infectious disease of the head or the chin. Okay? But if the priest examined this kind of sore, and it does not seem to be more than skin deep, and there is no black hair in it, then the priest is to put the infected person in isolation for 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the sore, and if the itch has not spread, and there is no yellow hair in it, and it does not appear to be more than skin deep, he must be shaved, except for the diseased area, and the priest is to keep him in isolation for another 7 days. On the 7th day, the priest is to examine the itch, and if it is not spread in the skin and appears to be no more than skin deep, the priest shall pronounce him clean. He must wash his clothes, and he will be clean. But if the itch does spread in the skin after he is pronounced clean, the priest is to examine him, and if the itch has spread in the skin, the priest does not need to look for yellow hair. The person is unclean. If, however, in his judgment, he gets to at least have some say here, unchanged, and a black hair is grown in it, the itch is healed. He is clean, and the priest shall pronounce him clean. When a man or woman has white spots on the skin, the priest is to examine them, okay? And if the spots are dull white, it is harmless rash that is broken out on the skin, that person is clean. And when a man has lost his hair and is bald, he is clean. That's pretty specific. And I'm sure there are a bunch of guys out there that I know that are like, well, thank goodness. If he has lost his hair from the front of his scalp and has a bald forehead, he is clean. But if he has a reddish white sore on his bald head or forehead, it is an infectious disease breaking out on his head or his forehead. Well, yes, that would make logical sense. The priest is to examine him, and if the swollen sore on his head or forehead is reddish white like an infectious skin disease, the man is diseased and is unclean. The priest shall pronounce him unclean because of the sore on his head. Yes, it's like all the rest of them. Okay. The person with such an infectious disease must wear torn clothes. Let his hair be unkept, or uncover his head, so no turban wearing. Cover the lower part of his face and cry out, unclean, unclean. As long as he has the infection, he remains unclean. He must live alone, and he must live outside the camp. Sorry there. I needed to ditch the sweatshirt. It's getting warm. All right. Regulations about mildew. If any clothing is contaminated with mildew, any woolen or linen clothing, any woven or knitted material of linen or wool, any leather or anything made of leather, and if the contamination in the clothing or the leather or the woven or knitted materials or any leather article is greenish or reddish, it is spreading mildew, and it must be shown to the priest. The priest is to examine the mildew and isolate the affected article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he is to examine it. And if the mildew has spread into the clothing or the woven or knitted material or the leather, whatever its use is a destructive mildew, and the article is unclean. It's not shaping up to sound like it's too good to be one of these priests. Like, first you got to slaughter a lot of animals. You got to keep a fire going. If you don't have the fire kept right, you can be set on fire. You got to examine people's, you got to butcher animals, examine people's skin diseases, and decide if something's mildewy. And this is before they had those, masks that we were all relying on during COVID and everything. This is not shaping up to be too good. The article is unclean. He must burn up the clothing or the woven or knitted material of wool or linen or any leather article that has contamination on it, because the mildew is destructive. The article must be burned up. But if, when the priest examines it, the mildew has not spread in the clothing or the woven or knitted material or the leather article, he shall order that the contaminated article be washed. Then he is to isolate it for another 7 days. After the affected article has been washed, the priest is to examine it, and if the mildew has not changed its appearance, even though it has not spread, it is unclean. Burn it with fire, whether the mildew has affected one side or the other. If the priest examines it and the mildew has faded after the article has been washed, he is to tear the contaminated part out of the clothing, I agree with that, or the leather, or the woven or knitted material. But if it reappears in the clothing, or the woven or knitted material, or in the leather article, it is spreading, and whatever has mildew must be burnt with fire. The clothing, or the woven or knitted material, or any leather article that has been washed and is rid of mildew must be washed again, and then it will be clean. These are the regulations concerning contamination by mildew in woolen, or linen clothing, woven or knitted materials, or any leather article for pronouncing them clean or unclean. Which you would have to imagine. I mean, because again, migratory people, 600,000 people roaming about, living in tents. You have this, you're responsible for all of them. And, yeah, it's the desert, but it rains sometimes, right? So the chances for mildew, the chances for skin disease, just imagine what happens in that kind of condition if mildew gets on one person's tent and they're camped too close to someone else. Or if a fire were to break out, or if somebody gets sick with something infectious, or that's why these. They need a lot more priests, though, if they're going to maintain this. Because 600,000 people, and there's, 3 of them? That's not a lot for 600,000 people. So, until the next video, friends.